The courthouse had always been a place of quiet authority, its marble floors echoing the footsteps of lawyers and officials who walked them daily. But on that morning, the air was different. It was thicker, charged with an energy that no one could ignore. People gathered in clusters along the hallway, whispering in low voices, glancing at one another with the nervous curiosity of those who sensed history was about to unfold. The tall wooden doors of the courtroom stood closed, hiding the scene that would soon demand everyone's attention. Inside the room, the tension was almost tangible. The polished wooden benches were already filled, the dark varnish gleaming under the glow of the overhead lights. A mixture of reporters, community members, and family sat shoulder to shoulder, some clutching notepads, others wringing their hands. Though the trial had been ongoing for weeks, the crowd was larger today. Rumors had spread that a child a mere 7 years old was set to testify. Few could imagine the bravery it would take for such a small girl to face the weight of a courtroom. Yet curiosity and expectation had drawn people in. The judge, an older man with a stern yet thoughtful face, sat high at the bench, tapping his gavel lightly against the wood as if to steady himself. Though he had presided over countless trials, there was something different about today. He had seen hardened criminals, dramatic confessions, and tearful victims, but never a child so young expected to carry so much. Behind his stern expression, even he felt an unease that he rarely allowed to surface. The prosecution sat at their table, their files neatly stacked, papers marked with colored tabs for quick reference. They had prepared meticulously, knowing the credibility of their case hinged on testimony that could withstand the scrutiny of cross-examination. Yet despite their preparation, worry lingered in their eyes. They knew the unpredictability of children. A 7-year-old could be honest and brave, but also frightened and silent. The smallest hesitation could unravel weeks of effort. Across from them, the defense team exuded forced confidence. Their lead attorney leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his notepad, pretending calm. In truth, his mind raced. He had rehearsed ways to discredit a child's testimony, careful to appear respectful while sowing seeds of doubt. He would rely on tone, on language, on the jury's natural hesitation to place such heavy weight on a child's words. Still, beneath his outward control, there was anxiety. Something about this case was unpredictable. The jury sat quietly, 12 faces lined in a row, each carrying their own unspoken thoughts. They were ordinary people suddenly burdened with extraordinary responsibility. Some looked restless, shifting in their seats, while others studied the floor, as if bracing themselves for what was coming. They knew children rarely took the stand, and the gravity of that fact pressed heavily upon them. The audience behind them, a mix of townspeople and outsiders, whispered among themselves. Some had come out of sympathy for the little girl, others out of curiosity, and some out of a darker fascination with the scandal that had gripped their community. No matter their reasons, each had come for the same purpose, to witness what would happen when innocence faced the harsh machinery of justice. At the back of the room, a woman sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was the girl's guardian, her protector, her anchor. She had shielded the child as best as she could, but today was beyond her control. Her eyes never left the doors where her little one would soon walk in. Every muscle in her body was tense, as though she could somehow absorb the pressure on the child's behalf. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man in uniform, moved deliberately around the room, his eyes scanning the audience. His presence was a reminder of order, of authority, and of the seriousness of what was about to occur. Though he had handled countless duties in courtrooms over the years, even he seemed more alert than usual. He knew that children carried with them a fragility that made everything different, everything more delicate. The smell of polished wood, faint cologne, and coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the quiet hum of anticipation. Every cough, every shuffle of paper, every creak of the bench echoed more loudly than usual, amplified by the silence that hung over the room. It was as though the entire courthouse itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment that would define the day. The accused sat at the defense table, shifting uncomfortably. He had avoided looking at the audience, avoided the gaze of the jury, and now avoided the thought of facing a child's testimony. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darted nervously. For weeks he had endured the prosecution's case, the evidence, and the witnesses. But nothing unsettled him more than the thought of a little girl speaking against him. He could silence adults. With arguments, he could challenge experts with technicalities. But how could one challenge the innocence of a child? And so the room waited. Seconds felt like minutes, and minutes felt like hours. Even those who did not believe in the power of words could not deny that something momentous was approaching. There was no shouting, no drama yet, but the quiet was louder than any uproar. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Bring in the witness," he instructed, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of gravity. The bailiff nodded and moved toward the doors. The audience leaned forward, all eyes fixed on the entrance. Pens were poised over notepads, and hearts quickened. The moment they had waited for was finally here. The doors creaked open. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and in that single moment, every sound in the courtroom seemed to vanish. Conversations stopped mid-whisper, pens froze above notepads, and even the faint tapping of the judge's gavel paused as though the building itself held its breath. Framed in the doorway stood a small figure, dwarfed by the sheer size of the doors behind her. She was only 7 years old, yet the eyes of dozens of strangers now bore down on her. Her shoes tapped softly against the polished marble floor. As she hesitated, clinging tightly to the hand of her guardian, the contrast between the towering, echoing courtroom and her fragile form was almost unbearable. She seemed like a tiny bird forced into a storm, her steps uncertain yet unavoidable. Her guardian, a woman with tired eyes but steady hands, whispered words of comfort that only the child could hear. The girl nodded faintly, though the stiffness in her body betrayed the fear she tried so hard to hide. Each step she took forward was met with a silent ripple through the crowd, an unspoken acknowledgement that innocence had just entered a place built for confrontation. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, his gaze softening as he watched her approach. He knew what was being asked of her was extraordinary, perhaps even unfair, but it was necessary. The truth of her testimony was vital. He reminded himself not to see her only as a child, but as a witness. Yet, as she walked timidly past the rows of wooden benches, it was nearly impossible to separate the two. The defense attorney leaned forward, pen no longer tapping. His eyes narrowed, calculating. He knew the sight of her alone would sway the jury, perhaps more than any evidence could. No matter how carefully he crafted his questions, no matter how politely he handled her on the stand, he could not control the natural human instinct to protect the young. Still, he studied her intently, searching for any sign of fragility he could later use to his advantage. The jury themselves leaned closer, their expressions softening. For days they had been listening to legal arguments, dense language, and evidence heavy with technicalities. But now, the case no longer felt abstract. A living, breathing child had entered the room, carrying with her a truth only she could share. For some jurors, the sight stirred paternal or maternal instincts. For others, it drew forth memories of their own children, nieces, or nephews. Whatever their backgrounds, the girl's presence pierced through their neutrality. At the back of the courtroom, the accused shifted uneasily. He avoided looking at her directly, but his discomfort betrayed him. The little girl represented something he could not easily dismiss. The truth she carried, even if spoken with the Simplicity of childhood had the potential to crush every defense he had carefully constructed. The girl's small hand tightened around her guardian's as she reached the front. Her eyes flicked nervously across the room, catching sight of the judge towering above her, the lawyers waiting like hunters, and the audience staring as though she were some fragile spectacle. Her lips pressed together, trembling slightly, but she did not cry. The judge, who had presided over countless cases, felt something shift within him. He softened his tone, leaning forward slightly, careful not to let his voice carry the same intimidating weight it usually did. "Good morning," he said gently, his words meant for her alone, though the entire courtroom heard them. "You may take your seat." The guardian gave her a reassuring squeeze before letting go. The girl took a hesitant step toward the witness stand. The wooden chair looked impossibly large, its size emphasizing just how small she truly was. She climbed onto it with effort, her feet dangling far above the floor. The bailiff stepped forward to adjust the microphone so that her small voice could be heard. A wave of emotion passed through the audience. Some pressed tissues to their faces, others clasped their hands tightly. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing this moment alone was newsworthy. But the girl herself seemed lost in the enormity of it all. Her eyes darted nervously toward the jury, then back to the table where the accused sat. Her breath quickened, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though fear might overwhelm her. That was when the judge leaned forward again. "You are safe here," he said softly, his voice carrying no trace of authority, only reassurance. "No one here can hurt you. You just need to tell the truth in your own words." The words lingered in the air like a shield, and the girl's breathing steadied slightly. She nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. For the first time since entering, she sat up a little straighter. Still, her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap, her small fingers tangling together. She looked toward her guardian, who mouthed silent encouragement. "You can do this." The prosecutor rose slowly, careful not to appear intimidating. His steps were measured, his voice deliberately soft. "Hello," he said warmly, as though speaking to his own daughter. "Do you know why you're here today?" The girl hesitated, her lips parting before quickly closing again. Her eyes fell to the police dog at her feet, brought in moments later by the bailiff. The dog, calm and steady, gazed up at her with trusting eyes. She reached down instinctively, her hand brushing his fur, and something inside her shifted. Comfort, safety. It was then that the room realized the little girl was not just a frightened child. Beneath her nerves, beneath the weight of the stairs, she carried something powerful. Though her voice trembled when she finally spoke, it was steady enough to carry through the microphone. "Yes," she whispered. Then, a little louder, "I'm here to tell the truth." And with that, the courtroom's silence deepened, not the silence of waiting, but the silence of reverence. Everyone knew they were about to hear something that could not be ignored. The stillness inside the courtroom was already fragile when the bailiff moved toward the doors again. People assumed he was stepping out to gather documents or relay instructions. Instead, a ripple of surprise swept through the room when he returned. And beside him padded a large German shepherd, his coat gleaming under the lights, his movements calm and measured. The sound of the dog's claws clicking against the polished wooden floor echoed strangely in the silent room. Dozens of eyes followed him, some widening in astonishment, others narrowing in curiosity. The courtroom had seen witnesses, lawyers, and officers walk through those doors countless times, but never a dog. The girl's head lifted the instant she heard the sound. Until that moment, her shoulders had been drawn tight, her tiny frame stiff with fear. But as the animal approached, something softened in her expression. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes brightened, and for the first time since she had entered, She no longer looked alone. The bailiff led the dog with deliberate care, stopping beside the witness stand. With a simple gesture, the officer gave the command, and the German shepherd lowered himself gracefully to the floor. He curled at the girl's feet, his body pressed close, his head lifted as if to stand guard over her. Gasps rippled quietly through the benches. Some leaned forward, eager to see how the unusual presence would unfold. Others exchanged skeptical glances, but even the most skeptical could not deny the change in the air. The girl reached down timidly, her small hand brushing the dog's fur. In that moment, her trembling seemed to ease, her breathing slowed, and her posture shifted just slightly toward strength. The judge raised his eyebrows, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. Though unorthodox, this was not entirely unexpected. In recent years, therapy dogs had occasionally been introduced into courtrooms to support vulnerable witnesses, especially children. Yet, the presence of such an animal in this trial, so high profile, so heavily scrutinized, carried an unusual weight. He cleared his throat, but allowed the silence to linger. Finally, he addressed the courtroom in his steady baritone. This witness is permitted the presence of the support animal. His words were brief, but they silenced any murmurs of objection. The defense attorney frowned slightly, but made no move to challenge the decision, perhaps realizing that doing so would paint him as heartless in the eyes of the jury. The German shepherd settled into place, his eyes alert, his breathing steady. He did not fidget, did not bark, did not demand attention. His presence was quiet, grounding, as though he knew his role was not to distract, but to strengthen. His mere existence beside the child created an anchor of calm in the midst of an intimidating storm. The girl's fingers moved again, stroking the dog's ear with gentle, rhythmic motions. The change was almost imperceptible, but those who watched closely could see it. Her hands no longer fidgeted nervously in her lap. Instead, they moved with purpose. Her lips no longer pressed tightly together. They softened slightly, almost forming the ghost of a smile. The jury noticed. Their gazes shifted from the dog to the girl and back again, silently acknowledging what everyone felt. The bond between them was undeniable. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't staged. It was something instinctive, natural, and pure. The prosecutor, who had been silently praying that the child would find strength, felt relief wash over him. He watched her straighten just slightly in her chair, her shoulders loosening as if some invisible burden had been lifted. It was clear she now felt protected. The defense attorney scribbled something on his notepad, though his movements betrayed agitation. He recognized the danger. The dog was not just an animal, he was a symbol. He represented loyalty, truth, and protection. And now, by association, the girl herself carried those same qualities in the eyes of the jury. How could he cross-examine her without appearing to attack not just a child, but also the embodiment of innocence and safety curled at her feet? The accused, however, was not so composed. He shifted again in his chair, his jaw tight, his gaze darting toward the dog before quickly turning away. His unease was visible, and the jurors noticed. It was subtle, but it was there. For all the hours of legal debate that had filled this room, nothing unsettled him quite like the silent presence of the animal who now watched the proceedings with steady eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. They knew this moment would dominate headlines by evening. Police dog brought to court to comfort child witness. They could already imagine the public's reaction. For readers, the image alone would be unforgettable. A fragile child leaning on the strength of a loyal dog, or the fate of a trial hung in the balance. The girl bent down, whispering softly to the dog. No one else could hear her words, but the act itself stirred the courtroom. For the first time, she was no longer just reacting to the intimidating atmosphere. She was creating her own sense of safety. The animal's ears twitched, his head tilting slightly toward her, as if he understood. The sight was disarming, powerful in its simplicity. The judge shifted in his seat. He was a man who believed in order, in procedure, in the clean structure of law. Yet he could not deny the emotional current coursing through his courtroom now. The little girl was still small, still fragile, but with the dog by her side, she appeared less like a victim and more like a figure of quiet strength. Even the bailiff, who had seen more trials than he could count, felt something stir inside him. He had escorted countless witnesses to the stand, but this was different. Watching the girl find courage in the presence of the animal reminded him of why justice mattered. It wasn't about winning or losing cases. It was about truth, about protecting those too small to protect themselves. The prosecutor rose again, careful in his movements. He knew the room was fragile, the balance delicate. "Are you comfortable?" he asked gently, his eyes meeting the girl's. She hesitated, then glanced down at the dog. Her fingers pressed into his fur, and her small nod followed. "Yes," she whispered. The sound of her voice, steady though soft, seemed to settle something in the room. The audience, who had been holding their breath, exhaled together in a subtle wave of relief. The girl was still afraid, that much was clear, but now she was not alone. The German shepherd had become more than a companion. He was a silent witness, a steady presence, a reminder that she could face the weight of the courtroom without breaking. And though no one said it aloud, every person in that room knew the course of the trial had just shifted. The police dog hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't testified. But his arrival had changed everything. The little girl's hand lingered in the soft fur of the German shepherd, her fingers curling and uncurling as though drawing courage from each strand. To anyone else, it might have looked like a nervous habit, but the truth was more profound. In the midst of marble walls, glaring lights, and the heavy eyes of strangers, she had found the only anchor she trusted, a dog who could not speak, but who seemed to understand her completely. The animal lifted his head slightly, his calm gaze fixed on her as if reassuring her without words. His steady breathing contrasted sharply with the tense silence surrounding them. Each exhale from him was slow, rhythmic, grounding her in the moment. She pressed her palm against his ear, her thumb brushing gently across it, and whispered. The whisper was too soft for the crowd to catch, but it did not matter. The act itself captivated everyone. A child, small and trembling, leaning into a dog for strength. There was no script, no performance, only instinct. And somehow, instinct carried more power than eloquence ever could. The judge leaned forward slightly, straining to hear. He knew he should not intrude on a private comfort, yet his curiosity was undeniable. What could she be saying? And more importantly, why did the sight of it stir something in his chest he could not name? The prosecutor lowered his pen, momentarily abandoning his notes. His strategy, carefully mapped out, seemed insignificant compared to the raw humanity unfolding before him. He was watching a transformation, not a child becoming fearless, but a child finding enough courage to hold steady despite the fear. And it all stemmed from a bond that no legal textbook could ever explain. The defense attorney, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably. He sensed the danger in the moment. Jurors were not merely listening. They were feeling. His training told him that feelings in a courtroom were unpredictable, dangerous, almost impossible to counter with logic. He drummed his fingers lightly against the desk, but his eyes betrayed agitation. The accused, seated beside him, refused to look at the girl. His gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him, jaw tight, shoulders hunched. To face her, even silently, would mean confronting the innocence he had hoped to dismiss. But the bond between her and the dog spoke louder than any accusation, louder than any evidence stacked against him. Among the jury, reactions varied. Some leaned forward, their eyes softening as they watched the girl whisper into the dog's ear. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, unable to stop herself from imagining her own granddaughter in that chair. A man clenched his jaw, his protective instincts rising. Another juror, usually stern and unreadable, tilted his head as though piecing together something larger. The truth often shines brightest in the simplest moments. The audience shifted too, some covering their mouths, others watching in awe. They had expected testimony, words and questions, but they had not expected to feel this much before the child had even spoken fully. The hush was so complete that even the faint hum of the air fence seemed intrusive. Then the girl leaned closer to the dog. Her lips moved again, this time slightly louder, though still delicate, fragile. "You're here with me," she whispered, the words carrying just far enough for the closest rows to hear. Gasps rippled through them, soft but unmistakable. The German shepherd did not move, except for a slow blink and the tilt of his head, as though acknowledging her statement. To the girl, it was confirmation. She smiled faintly, tiny, fleeting, but powerful. The judge cleared his throat, not to reprimand, but to reorient the room. "Please continue," he said, his tone softer than usual, almost paternal. Yet even as he spoke, he knew something had shifted. The girl had already spoken not to him, not to the lawyers, but to the dog, and in doing so, she had changed the entire atmosphere. The prosecutor took a cautious step forward. "You're doing very well," he said, his voice gentle. He did not press her, not yet. He knew the strength she found in the dog's presence was fragile, and to force her too quickly might shatter it. Instead, he waited, letting the bond build in its own rhythm. The girl sat straighter now. Her hand still rested on the dog, her fingers tracing absent circles on his fur. With him beside her, she seemed less like a child, trapped in an overwhelming room and more like a small figure guarded by a silent sentinel. The contrast was stark, the cold authority of the courtroom versus the warmth of companionship at her feet. The defense attorney finally leaned back in his chair, sighing quietly. He recognized the battle forming. How could he cross-examine a child who whispered to a dog with such trust? How could he appear composed, professional, and detached while jurors saw the image of innocence and loyalty intertwined? He scribbled a note-stick to facts, a void tone, but even as he wrote, he doubted its power. For the audience, time seemed to stretch. This was not the usual ebb and flow of legal argument. It was something deeper, more human. They weren't just witnesses to a trial. They were witnesses to a bond forming right before their eyes. And then came the moment that silenced even the faintest of whispers. The girl turned slightly toward the microphone, her hand still on the dog, and said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "You saw it, didn't you?" Her words hung in the air, delicate yet piercing. The audience froze, the jury froze. Even the judge froze. It was not testimony in the traditional sense. No recounting of events, no rehearsed answers. But it was powerful. It was a child affirming that she was not alone in what she knew. The German shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes calm but focused. To anyone logical, it was just an animal responding to a sound. But to the girl, and perhaps to everyone else, it felt like acknowledgement. The courtroom had been filled with legal arguments for days, but none carried the weight of that one small exchange between child and dog. It was unspoken, yet undeniable. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't just anticipation, it was reverence. Even those who doubted the reliability of a child's words felt the impact of her conviction. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't pleading. She was stating what she believed. that the truth had been witnessed, and that she was not carrying it alone. The judge's gavel rested unused in his hand. The prosecutor remained still, his throat tight. The defense attorney glanced toward the jury, reading their expressions with growing unease. And the accused, his knuckles whitened. His breathing shallow looked more unsettled than ever. The girl stroked the dog again, her whisper softer now, almost lost in the hum of the room. "It's okay, we'll tell them." The dog's tail brushed once against the floor. And with that, the unspoken bond became the most powerful testimony yet. For a long moment, the courtroom was wrapped in stillness, the kind that makes even the faintest sound feel deafening. The girl sat at the witness stand, one hand buried in the thick fur of the police dog at her side, her eyes downcast but alert. Everyone could sense that something was building. She had already whispered to him before, so softly that only she and the dog knew what had been said. But now her lips parted again, and this time the words did not hide. "You were there," she said suddenly, her voice louder, though still carrying the soft tone of a child. She leaned toward the German shepherd, looking directly into his dark, intelligent eyes. Her hand pressed gently against his head. "You saw what he did." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward. At first, there was disbelief. The jury froze mid-breath, eyes widening. The defense attorney's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the desk, drawing no attention, because every eye was locked on the child. The prosecutor blinked, his carefully prepared notes meaningless now. The judge, who had seen every manner of testimony, shifted forward in his chair, his expression startled and uncharacteristically human. And then came the murmur. A faint wave of whispers broke across the benches in the back of the courtroom, audience members exchanging shocked looks. Some tilted toward one another, their voices too low to hear, but their expressions clear. "Did you hear that?" She said the dog saw it. Others sat stiffly, gripping the edges of their seats, as though afraid to breathe too loudly in the wake of such a moment. The accused flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but to those who had been watching him closely, it was telling. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and he shifted slightly in his chair, no longer able to maintain the mask of indifference. His eyes flickered toward the child, before darting away again. It was the first crack in his carefully built facade, and the jury noticed. The defense attorney scrambled to recover, adjusting his glasses and gathering his composure. He knew the words of a child could not count as evidence in the literal sense. Dogs could not testify. But he also knew jurors were not machines. They were people with hearts and instincts, and people could be moved by the innocence of a child's belief. If the jurors believed she was telling the truth, even unconsciously, it would stick in their minds far longer than any technical objection he could raise. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order as the murmur swelled. "Silence," he instructed, though even his voice was unsteady. The gavel came down again. "The witness may continue. There will be no interruptions." But no one could truly continue as if nothing had happened. The atmosphere had changed. The balance of power in the room had shifted. The girl had not pointed at the accused, had not delivered a dramatic speech, yet her words had struck with more force than any accusation before. The prosecutor hesitated, then took a cautious step closer. His voice was gentle, almost tentative. "Can you tell us what you mean by that?" The little girl looked at him, then back at the dog, her fingers never leaving the animal's fur. Her eyes shone with both fear and determination. "He knows," she said simply. "He saw everything just like me." The room went still again. To the adults, the logic faltered. Dogs could not speak, could not testify, could not give sworn statements. But to the child, her words were absolute. In her mind, the dog had been present, had witnessed what she had witnessed, and in speaking to him, she had found the courage to share her truth. Her innocence stripped away layers of legal complexity and reduced it to something simple. The truth exists, and it was seen. Several jurors shifted, their expressions conflicted. One man pressed his lips tightly together, his eyes fixed on the little girl with a mix of sorrow and admiration. A woman clasped her hands in her lap, her eyes glistening with tears she fought to contain. Another leaned back slowly, shaking his head not in disbelief of the child, but in awe of the weight her words carried. The defense attorney rose sharply, his voice cutting into the moment. "Objection, Your Honor. The child is speaking to the animal, not to the court. A dog cannot be considered a witness. This is—" The judge's gavel struck the bench. "The objection is noted," he said firmly, though his face betrayed hesitation. "However, the jury will disregard what the dog saw. They are to focus only on the testimony of the witness." But everyone in the room knew that no one could truly disregard it. The image of a child leaning into a police dog and speaking with such conviction was burned into their minds. The accused exhaled sharply, his discomfort visible. The room was no longer his battleground. It belonged to the little girl and the silent dog who sat guard at her side. The prosecutor did not press her further on the words. He knew better than to push. Instead, he guided her gently into recounting the events in her own way, letting her voice build upon the strength she had already found. With each sentence, the girl's confidence grew, not loud, not bold, but steady. And every time her voice faltered, her hand found the dog, and the tremor passed. For the audience, it was not merely testimony. It was a story unfolding before them. They could see the invisible thread between child and animal, feel the raw honesty radiating from her words, and sense the unease settling over the accused. By the time she finished her account, the courtroom was no longer simply a place of law. It had become a theater of truth, where innocence spoke more loudly than logic, and where a whisper to a dog carried more weight than hours of legal argument. And though the judge tried to restore order, though the defense prepared to cross-examine, and though procedure demanded the trial continue, one thing was already certain. No one who had been present would ever forget the moment a little girl leaned into a police dog and said, "You saw what he did." For several seconds after the little girl's words, the courtroom was locked in silence. It wasn't the ordinary silence of a courtroom waiting for the next question. It was heavier, thicker than almost unbearable pause where no one dared to move. The child's voice still echoed in their ears. "You saw what he did." Though spoken to a dog, the sentence had landed on every heart in the room. The judge was the first to move. He gripped the gavel, tapping it lightly against the bench. The sharp crack reverberated through the chamber, a desperate attempt to bring order back into a space that had tipped into emotion. "Order in the court," he commanded, his voice strong, but not without strain. But order did not come easily. Whispers spread like wildfire across the audience benches. Some leaned toward one another, exchanging hurried comments, their expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. A woman in the back pressed her hands over her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. A man near the front shook his head slowly, as though unable to comprehend the gravity of what had just happened. On the jury bench, 12 faces bore the weight of the moment. Some looked stricken, their eyes softening with compassion for the girl. Others looked unsettled, their brows furrowed as they wrestled with the clash between emotion and law. One juror in particular, a middle-aged father with graying hair, found himself picturing his own daughter at that age, fragile, trusting, holding on to the one being she believed could protect her. The thought made his throat tighten. The prosecutor remained frozen in place, his notes forgotten in his hand. He knew, with a prosecutor's instinct, that nothing he said in that moment could equal the weight of the child's words. To press her now with more questions would risk tainting the purity of what had already been spoken. So he stood still, his eyes steady on the girl, silently acknowledging that her innocence had done more for the case than any crafted argument of his own. The defense attorney, on the other hand, was pale. His jaw clenched as he scribbled frantically. In his notebook, though the words he wrote were meaningless, a distraction to hide his racing thoughts. He understood the danger. Logic dictated that a dog's supposed testimony was irrelevant, inadmissible. But trials were not won on logic alone. They were won in hearts and minds. And in the minds of the jury, the image of the girl speaking to the dog had already taken root. It would haunt them in deliberation, no matter how many times the judge told them to disregard it. The accused shifted in his chair. His hands fidgeted against the table, fingers tapping nervously. He had sat through weeks of this trial with a mask of composure, but now cracks appeared. The jury could see his discomfort. He refused to look at the girl, his eyes darting instead to the floor, to the ceiling, anywhere but her small frame sitting so firmly in the witness chair. Sweat beaded at his brow. His breathing was shallow. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him. The girl, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the storm she had unleashed. She continued to pet the German shepherd, whispering softly to him with the innocence of someone who did not understand the magnitude of her words. In her world, the dog had been there, had witnessed what she had witnessed. To her, that truth was simple, unshakable. She did not speak to sway a jury or to convict a man. She spoke because it was what she believed. The judge struck the gavel. Again. Silence, he repeated, firmer now. This court will maintain order. The murmurs died down reluctantly, though the undercurrent of tension remained. He turned his gaze to the jury, his tone deliberate. You are instructed to consider only the sworn testimony of the witness. The presence of the support animal is not evidence. Do you all understand? 12 heads nodded. Yet in their eyes, it was clear that the instruction, all heard, could never erase what they had just felt. The defense attorney rose. His voice was tight, forced. Your Honor, with all respect, I must move for the court to strike the last remarks from the record. The child was speaking to the animal, not to the court. Such statements are overruled, the judge interrupted, his gavel striking again. His voice carried authority, but his hesitation betrayed him. He knew the defense was technically right, but to strike the words from the record would only draw more attention to them. The jury will disregard. But everyone in the room knew the words could not be disregarded. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, frustration etched on his face. He glanced at his client, whose pale complexion and nervous fidgeting did nothing to inspire confidence. The prosecutor inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He knew the trial could not rest on a child's whispered statement alone. Yet he also recognized the undeniable impact it had made. He decided to proceed cautiously, giving the girl space to breathe, to feel safe, before guiding her gently back into recounting her story. Thank you, he said softly, stepping closer but careful not to crowd her. You're very brave. Could you tell us, in your own words, what happened? The girl glanced at the dog, her fingers curling into his fur for reassurance. Then, she lifted her gaze, her eyes wide but steady. She began to speak, her voice trembling at first, but growing firmer as she continued. Every ear strained to hear. Every pen scratched furiously against paper. The story she told was not dramatic in its delivery, but it was devastating in its simplicity. She described what she had seen, where she had been, what had been done. Her words lacked adult embellishment, but their plainness made them all the more haunting. As she spoke, the courtroom reacted in quiet, powerful ways. Some jurors leaned forward, their brows knit in concentration. One clutched his pen tightly, knuckles white. Another pressed a hand against her mouth, fighting back tears. Even the bailiff, standing like a statue by the door, shifted slightly, his jaw tight, his eyes softer than usual. The accused sank lower in his chair. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he did not respond. His face was flushed, his eyes downcast, his composure unraveling. When the girl finished, silence filled the room once more. It was not the shocked silence of her earlier whisper, but a heavier one, thick with the weight of her testimony. The truth now sat in the air like a living thing, impossible to banish. The judge cleared his throat, his voice softer than before. "Thank you," he said to the child. "You may rest for a moment." She nodded, leaning into the dog once more, her small body trembling slightly from the effort of her words. The German Shepherd shifted closer, his head resting protectively against her knee. The courtroom had heard the truth. And though the trial was far from over, though cross-examinations and closing arguments still loomed ahead, everyone knew the case had just been altered irreversibly. The whisper had changed everything. After the whisper that had stunned the courtroom, a tense silence lingered. The little girl, still gripping the thick fur of the German Shepherd at her side, took a deep breath. She had found the courage to speak, and now she had to tell everything she knew. Every detail mattered, no matter how small, and she understood that her words could alter the course of the trial. Though she was only 7, her memory was vivid. She remembered everything, the sounds, the sights, the fear, and the weight of the secret she had carried. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands folded in front of him. Even he, accustomed to countless witnesses, felt the unique gravity of the moment. He had expected hesitant, fragmented testimony, but what he now sensed was a quiet determination, radiating from a small figure who, for a brief moment, seemed older than her years. A prosecutor stepped closer, speaking softly to avoid startling her. "Can you tell us, in your own words, exactly what you saw?" She looked down at the dog and stroked his head once more. Then she lifted her gaze and spoke, her voice still soft, but deliberate. "I saw him," she began. "And he did things that were very wrong. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Her fingers tightened against the dog's fur, seeking reassurance. The German Shepherd leaned slightly into her, a silent acknowledgement that she was not alone. The courtroom held its collective breath. Every juror, lawyer, and spectator leaned forward, hanging on each word. Even the defense attorney paused, pen poised over his notebook, but momentarily immobilized by the sincerity of her testimony. The accused sat rigidly, jaw clenched, hands gripping the table, eyes darting away from the little girl. She continued, describing the events with clarity and honesty. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She simply recounted what she had seen. "He took things that weren't his," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He shouted at people, and I remember hearing someone cry. I was hiding, but I saw everything. The dog saw it too." The jury shifted in their seats, captivated. It wasn't just the words. It was the innocence, the authenticity, and the bravery of the girl. She was not performing for them, not acting to influence the outcome. She was merely telling the truth as she remembered it. Each statement she made carried an emotional weight that legal arguments could not match. The defense attorney scribbled furiously, trying to plan his next move. Technically, he knew the child's recollection was admissible, but emotionally, he was aware that each word she spoke created a bond with the jury that was almost impossible to break. He whispered instructions to the accused, who shook his head slightly, as though the gravity of the testimony was finally penetrating his carefully constructed detachment. The audience, too, reacted quietly but intensely. Mothers clutched there, children a little closer, Fathers shifted uneasily in their seats, and reporters scribbled feverishly, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would remain in memory long after the trial ended. Some faces were pale, others somber, but all eyes remained fixed on the small witness and her steadfast companion. As she continued, the girl recounted the emotions she had felt: fear, confusion, and sadness. "I wanted to tell someone," she said, "but I was scared. I didn't know who would believe me. The dog stayed with me. He made me feel safe. I wasn't alone." The German shepherd remained perfectly still at her feet, his calm presence steadying her. He had become more than a silent companion. He was a witness in spirit, a reminder of courage, and a symbol of the child's resilience. The prosecutor nodded subtly, encouraging her to continue without interrupting. "It's okay," he said gently. "Just tell us what happened." She swallowed and went on, detailing the events carefully, recounting what had occurred in sequence. She spoke of what she had observed, the sounds that had frightened her, and the small actions she had taken to stay safe. Each word was precise yet heartfelt, painting a vivid picture of the scene that only a child could describe with such clarity and honesty. The courtroom was silent, absorbed entirely by her story. It was not just a child speaking. It was truth manifested in a simple, unflinching form. The jurors leaned closer, some unconsciously holding their breath, as if the words themselves carried the weight of judgment. The defense attorney finally stood, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, may I cross-examine?" he asked, his voice tight. The judge nodded. "Proceed, but be mindful of the witness's age and vulnerability." Even as the questioning began, the little girl remained calm, anchored by the dog's presence. She answered honestly, without hesitation, her words clear and consistent. The jury could see the bravery it required for her to face a room full of adults, legal authority figures, and the very man she was speaking against. As the testimony unfolded, the accused became visibly unsettled. He shifted in his chair, sweat forming at his brow. His attorney's questions, meant to intimidate or confuse, fell flat against the child's simple but truthful responses. Every time he tried to challenge her, the jury saw her determination, her courage, and the silent support of the German shepherd. When she finished recounting the events, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. It was not a silence of boredom, nor one of passive waiting. It was a silence of comprehension, of empathy, and of the realization that the truth had been revealed in its purest form. The judge cleared his throat, his gavel resting idly in his hand. "Thank you," he said to the child. "You may step down for a moment." The little girl nodded, climbing down from the witness stand carefully. She returned to her guardian, still holding on to the dog, who had been her anchor throughout. The courtroom slowly exhaled, though the tension lingered in the air. Everyone understood that the testimony they had just heard was extraordinary, not because of legal technicalities, but because of the sheer honesty and bravery of a child confronting a harrowing truth. The prosecutor gathered his notes, satisfied that her account had been delivered with clarity and impact. The defense attorney slumped in his chair, frustrated and aware that the narrative had already begun to form in the minds of the jury. The audience lingered in their seats, many whispering softly, still absorbing the weight of what had been revealed. Even seasoned court reporters paused, pens hovering, recognizing that this testimony would be remembered for years, not just for the case itself, but for the courage and integrity displayed by a child who refused to remain silent. The German shepherd remained at the girl's side, vigilant and composed. His presence had been a silent reassurance throughout, and now, as she returned to her guardian's side, he exuded the same unwavering loyalty and protection. He had been witness, companion, and shield. By the end of Part 7, the courtroom was no longer just a space of procedure and law. It had become a place where truth had been spoken, courage had been demonstrated, and the bond between a child and an animal had transcended fear, intimidation, and expectation. The little girl had not only recounted events, she had revealed the essence of truth itself, and in doing so, left an indelible mark on everyone present. The courtroom had never quite returned to its usual rhythm. Even after the little girl stepped down from the witness stand, supported by her guardian, and with the police dog faithfully at her side, the weight of her testimony lingered like a dense fog. People whispered softly to one another, but no conversation could erase what they had seen. The innocence and bravery of a child, coupled with the silent support of a loyal animal, had left a mark on every heart present. The judge sat at his bench, reflecting on the extraordinary turn of events. Though his role demanded impartiality, he could not deny that the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for legal argument. It had become a stage for courage and truth. He reviewed the facts of the case in his mind, recognizing that the testimony he had just witnessed carried an authenticity beyond technical evidence. It had penetrated to the core of human understanding, innocence speaking truth. The jury remained still, their expressions a mix of contemplation, awe, and deep empathy. For days, they had listened to lawyers, experts, and witnesses, parsing technicalities and weighing evidence. But the little girl's words, her calm courage, and the unspoken bond with the police dog had reached them on a deeper emotional level. Her testimony was clear and concise, yet it carried a weight that could not be quantified. Every detail she recounted had been precise. Every emotion she expressed had been genuine, and every glance toward the dog had reinforced her courage. Some jurors whispered quietly to one another during breaks, sharing impressions, but always with a reverence that bordered on awe. One juror, an older man with a lifelong career in teaching, noted quietly to his neighbor, "I've never seen someone so young face such fear and remain so honest." She carried herself with a strength can hardly describe. Another juror, a woman who had recently become a mother, admitted silently that she had cried, moved by the pure courage and vulnerability of a child confronting the adult world of law. The defense attorney, seated beside the accused, wrestled with frustration and defeat. He had tried every method to challenge the child's credibility, relying on legal strategy and technical arguments. Yet, the reality of human emotion had proven far more potent than procedural maneuvering. He realized, grimly, that the bond between child and dog had created a perception in the minds of the jury that could never be undone. The innocence of the witness had become a force beyond the reach of objections or technicalities. The accused, meanwhile, had retreated into himself. He had tried to appear indifferent, composed, and calculated, but the courtroom had seen through his facade. The child's testimony, delivered with quiet clarity and emotional resonance, had unmasked his fear and discomfort. Every subtle tremor, every uneasy glance he cast toward the little girl, had been observed by the jury. He was no longer just defending his case. He was confronting the moral weight of the truth laid bare before him. After recess, proceedings resumed with a renewed focus. The prosecutors moved carefully, presenting their final arguments with the clarity and evidence necessary to support the girl's account. But even they recognized that the most compelling evidence had already spoken. A small voice, paired with the unwavering presence of a dog, had communicated the truth in a way that legal documents, expert testimony, and procedural arguments never could. The jury deliberated with intensity. Behind closed doors, they reviewed each point of evidence, yet the child's words and demeanor remained central in their minds. Her bravery, the details of what she had witnessed, and the comforting presence of the dog had created a narrative that transcended mere technicality. The truth she revealed was simple, human, undeniable, and it resonated more powerfully than any argument that could be made in court. Outside the courtroom, the story of the trial began to spread. Reporters captured the scene, emphasizing the child's courage and the extraordinary support of the police dog. Social media posts, news articles, and opinion pieces highlighted the uniqueness of the moment. People everywhere were struck by the image of a small child, trembling yet resolute, leaning into a loyal animal for strength, while revealing the truth to a room of strangers. Her story became a symbol of courage, innocence, and integrity, resonating far beyond the confines of the courthouse walls. When the jury returned, their expressions were solemn but resolute. The deliberation had been long, measured, and thoughtful. But one thing had become clear. The child's testimony had illuminated the truth in a way that could not be ignored. The verdict, when finally announced, was received with a hushed tension. The courtroom held its collective breath as the foreperson spoke, stating the decision with clarity, finality, and the weight of justice delivered. As the case concluded, the little girl and her guardian left the courtroom, the police dog faithfully walking beside them. Outside, sunlight streamed across the steps, a gentle contrast to the tension that had filled the room. Photographers captured the trio's exit, but the girl, though small and quiet, exuded a calm strength. She had faced fear, spoken truth, and remained steadfast despite the weight of an entire courtroom upon her shoulders. In the days that followed, the trial became a story shared widely, not just for its legal significance, but for its human impact. Communities discussed the courage of the child, the role of therapy and support animals, and the importance of allowing truth to be heard, even from the youngest voices. The story inspired conversations in schools, workplaces, and social circles, emphasizing empathy, bravery, and the quiet power of honesty. For the girl, the experience left a lasting impression. Though she was small, she had learned the truth carried a weight far beyond fear. She had discovered the power of courage and support, realizing that even the smallest voice, paired with steadfast companions, could alter the course of events. The police dog, ever loyal, had remained her anchor, demonstrating the quiet strength of companionship and protection. For the courtroom participants, the judge, the attorneys, the jurors, and the audience, the trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had been a lesson in humanity, showing that courage is not measured in size or age, but in the willingness to stand for what is right. The impact of the child's testimony and the silent support of the dog left an indelible impression, one that would inform their understanding of justice, empathy, and human resilience for years to come. And so, in a small courtroom in the United States, the extraordinary unfolded. A little girl, aided by a faithful police dog, spoke truth with unwavering courage. The legal process moved forward, the verdict was rendered, and justice was served. But beyond that, a story of bravery, innocence, and the quiet power of support left a lasting mark on everyone who witnessed it. The child had spoken, the dog had remained vigilant, and the world, however briefly, had paused to recognize that truth. And courage can emerge from the smallest of voices, leaving an impact far larger than anyone could have imagined.